So I want to welcome everybody to tonight's virtual author event hosted by Revolution Books. This is a very timely event that we have tonight because we're in a time of massive outpouring of people into the streets that began towards the end of May in the wake of the police murder of George Floyd, another televised murder because it was caught on videotape and seen across the country and around the world. This is one that resonated on the heartstrings of many, many people and became like no more. And people flowed into the streets and have stayed in the streets and are raising big demands and trying to get at how did we get here? How did we get to a situation where police murder people, especially Black and brown people, do it again and again, are caught in the act, including caught on video in the act, yet still it goes on. Well, Stuart's book, from a important angle, gets into how did we get here? How did we get to a point of policing like this? And his book is Badges Without Borders: How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. And this book will bring to light for you some things you probably didn't know. And I say that as somebody who knows a lot about policing. It's something that I've been dealing with. Well, I've been dealing with it all my life because I'm Black in America, and I could go back to my childhood and, bring up some things, but I won't right now. But I've also been dealing with it as an activist and a revolutionary fighting to end it. For those of you who may not know me, know who I am. I'm a longtime revolutionary. My activism goes back to refusing to go to Vietnam. Back in 1970, I was part of the Fort Lewis six GIs who refused orders to go to Vietnam. I went to Leavenworth for that stand. I came out of Leavenworth 2 years later looking for the revolution, connected up, and ended up connecting with the Revolutionary Communist Party at its founding. And that's a stance I've been on all the way down from the 1970s to today. And as part of that stance, I have been fighting to end police terror, fighting to expose how it comes out. I co-founded the October 22nd Coalition to Stop Police Brutality, Repression, and the Criminalization of a Generation. Well, for right now, that's me. That's who I am. Maybe more will come up in my back and forth with Stuart. Let's get to the event tonight. I should tell you that Stuart Schrader is the Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship, and he's a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, in addition to being the author of this important book. Stuart is going to read from the book and talk about it. Then he and I are going to go back and forth a bit. And then we're going to open it up to the questions from the audience. And at some point along the line, Raymond Latta will tell you a little bit more about Revolution Books. But for right now, I'm going to give you over to Stuart, and he's going to get into his book, Badges Without Borders.
Thank you so much, Carl, for that introduction, and thank you for all of your incredible and powerful work over the years. And also thank you to Revolution Books. I really appreciate this event. I appreciate Revolution Books, and I feel even now, maybe even more so than ever, I feel the importance of revolutionary spaces in New York City where we can convene. And it's unfortunate that we can't convene in person right now, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity to do it virtually. So what I thought I would do is just read a few pages from the beginning of the book to all of you, to kind of give you a flavor of what I'm doing in the book, and then I'll maybe talk a little bit very briefly about what comes after what I read, and then we can get into the Q&A. And I guess one other thing that I'll just say also is that I really appreciate that Revolution Books is making the book available at a discount right now. So I encourage everybody who's tuned in to pick up the book from Revolution Books website. So this is the opening of the book, and I'll just read a few pages. So this is how it starts. Imagine a large format photograph with a prison looming in the foreground. The print renders the building in impeccable detail. Sunlight glints off the razor wire. You can count the bars on the windows and make out the piercing eyes of guards in the towers. What's more, you can see a new wing of the building now under construction, which will transform the site into a justice complex, integrating corrections, courts, and police. A state-of-the-art training facility for police officers will be built next door. You spy the helmeted welders and bricklayers, and off to the side are the elected officials planning the ceremonial ribbon cutting. They'll congratulate themselves on fulfilling campaign promises to be tough on crime. Prison officials, police chiefs, and criminology experts will be in the audience, satisfied that their own advocacy of law and order has paid off. This picture also illustrates the most important aspect of the prison. People peering from behind those barred windows, locked up. Their parents stolen from children, children stolen from parents. Their lives have been shortened and depleted. Look closer, and you realize that this photograph is not the work of a single artist. It is a collage of different moments, and it is the work of activists, journalists, and scholars who have transformed a movement for racial justice into a new way of understanding the history of the United States. This collage puts the prison at the center of the social and political history of the past 4 decades, if not the past 15. And the prison is really a broader agglomeration of punitive policies that depend on aggressive policing, extravagant sentences, and court-mandated surveillance and pecuniary penalties. The effects are far-reaching. Almost 2.3 million people in the United States are locked in jail or prison on any given day, with another 4.5 million on parole or probation. Jails and prisons are unhealthy places, and these levels of incarceration are among the reasons why the United States has lagged behind other wealthy countries in growth of its average life expectancy in recent decades. Black men overall lose 3.09 years of life expectancy to prison or jail, Latino men 1.06 years, and white men 0.5 years. For women, these subtractions from life expectancy average 0.23, 0.09, and 0.05 years respectively. Around 19 million Americans have a felony conviction record, and many more a record of arrest, making them ineligible for multiple types of employment and civic benefits, including voting rights in some states. Interactions with this system start at age 12 on average among Black youth. These interactions almost invariably begin with police. Yet this detailed illustration of the prison complex and its effects in the photograph's foreground sits against a background that remains hazy. Its structures and shapes are indistinct. From the existing rendering, it is unclear how pathways that disappear into the horizon connect with the police and guards in the foreground. This background is an imperial project. It is the US effort to assure its national security by assuring the internal security of countries across the globe. To look at that background is to grasp that although the history of policing and prisons within the United States appears grotesque, the true extent is worse. This US apparatus has encircled and encaged the globe. This book reimagines the collage, clarifying its nebulous background. Badges without borders shifts figure and ground, bringing into focus that imperial project. This simple movement reveals that the growth and empowerment of cops in cages beginning in the 1960s was not independent of that imperial background, but has been intimately tied to it. The ideas and people essential to the background were ideas and people essential to the foreground. They were one and the same. To look at these policymakers and their maneuvers to bolster law enforcement around the globe after World War II is to understand who the builders of the carceral state were, how they crafted this policy, and why they did it. Racially invidious policing and incarceration within the United States, which many have worked so hard to bring to public consciousness, do not represent the sum of state building in the name of law and order. A close look at the collage's background reveals that many of the law enforcement leaders who stewarded the rise of this new penal apparatus had already been engaging in a program of deterritorialized state building. They crafted policy designs and rationales overseas. They deployed technical expertise to any country that would have them, helping endow these states with up-to-date repressive capacities and bolstering authoritarianism. And they then policed American streets like foreign territory. Black radicals at the time understood, named, and condemned this interrelationship that the book excavates, sometimes calling it internal colonialism. Although some have questioned the concept's utility for analyzing political economy, its undisputed strength was its focus on policing. As the objects of counter-subversive policing, Black radicals mounted critiques of US policy overseas by refracting it through their experiences back home, situating the United States in the world, and the world in the United States. Bobby Seale of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, for example, declared in a prescient 1967 article, "The racist military police force occupies our community just like the foreign American troops in Vietnam." An occupying military was unaccountable and vicious. Residents could not reason with it. Police in Black neighborhoods were the same. Seale predicted the long, hot summer that began with small uprising against police in Tampa and Cincinnati, followed by massive ones in New York and Detroit. Police then redoubled efforts to upgrade their own technologies, training, and techniques. New left radicals with organizations like the North American Congress on Latin America and the Institute for Policy Studies, who studied these projects, confirmed the links between war overseas and repression at home, using every government document they could obtain. Before it became a topic of scholarly inquiry, Black radical intellectuals like Seale highlighted the centrality of policing and prisons to American political development, while also connecting repression of freedom movements at home to repression of anti-colonial efforts overseas. Personal experience with police taught them counterinsurgency's first principle. It is not only insurgents or criminals who must be pacified, but entire populations. This book's inquiry into the development of the carceral state as racialized social control stands on the foundation these thinkers built, taking their political analyses seriously and matching them with extensive new archival research using records unavailable at the time. This research shows that the relationship that made the policing of Seale's Oakland neighborhood feel like colonial occupation depended on longstanding personal and institutional connections across borders. So that's the first few pages of the book. And so what I go on to do after this point is to focus on one particular node in the apparatus of the US national security state called the Office of Public Safety. The Office of Public Safety came into existence officially in 1962, although precursors to it existed earlier. And what the Office of Public Safety did was to train, assist, advise, and equip police in 52 countries around the globe, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And it also had a training academy in Washington, D.C. called the International Police Academy, which trained 70 cops from 77 countries. Around 9,000 police from around the world attended the International Police Academy. And what I show in the book is that this police assistance program around the globe that the United States built was designed to prevent revolution from breaking out in so-called third world countries, newly independent countries. The idea was that police could keep close tabs on the population, could watch over subversive movements or or even not so subversive movements, labor movements, student organizations, all of these came under the observation of police assisted by the United States. And oftentimes they would make a conflation between ordinary criminal activity and subversive activity. And they would argue that in order to control subversive activity, police needed to be able to control ordinary criminal activity. And so some of the techniques that these American experts with the Office of Public Safety would teach to police in other parts of the other parts of the globe would be ones that would be very familiar on the streets of New York City, like stop and frisk. The people who ran the Office of Public Safety, and there were several hundred of them over the years engaged in this advising work abroad. Many of them were the foremost policing and law enforcement experts in the United States at the time. They taught in colleges that offered, criminology classes. They taught in police academies themselves. Some of them were police chiefs or high-ranking commanders in forces like the Los Angeles Police Department. Some of them were federal law enforcement agents working previously with the Border Patrol or other agencies. And some of them had military experience, including going back to World War II. And they went abroad, some of them for just a brief period, some of them for 2 decades, working in a number of different countries around the globe. And they might end up traveling from Indonesia to Pakistan to Brazil over the course of their career. And so they would try to bring the same types of techniques of policing and surveillance with them everywhere they went. And they would, of course, also try to introduce US technologies and equipment, ranging from very mundane things like handcuffs to more sophisticated telecommunications technologies, as well as tear gas, which I spend a whole chapter talking about tear gas, and I'd be happy to talk more about that today. So that's the outward looking part of the book, the part beyond the borders of the United States. But there's a secondary component, which is that I look as well at how these experts, these law enforcement experts, brought many of their ideas, technologies, repertoires back with them to the United States when they returned home. And some of them returned home to go back into municipal policing or into federal law enforcement. Some of them joined new private security firms, which continue to operate overseas. Some of them went on to be prison wardens in the United States. Some of them became private detectives. So I look at a number of ways through technology, through training of police, through new ideas and ideologies about crime, that this overseas program, the Office of Public Safety, and the sort of larger ecosystem of law enforcement beyond the borders of the United States, how it influenced law enforcement within the United States. And of course, starting in the 1960s, the Johnson administration declared a so-called war on crime. And a number of the individuals that I look at in the book and the institutions fed directly into the war on crime. And I would even argue, as I do in the book, that the very design of the war on crime, which took money and resources from Washington and distributed it to states and municipalities, that very design of taking expertise from Washington and resources from Washington and passing it along had previously been tried, devised in the Overseas Police Assistance Program of the Office of Public Safety. So it's a blueprint, or at least an analog of what becomes the war on crime, which many scholars before my own work have shown that the war on crime that the United States declared in the midst of the civil rights and Black Power movements, and indeed in response to them, that this fed directly into what we come to know as mass incarceration or the carceral state. So the institutions that I look at in the book play a deep and until now somewhat, I think, subterranean role that we haven't fully perceived. Although, of course, as I've already mentioned, I'm building on the work of a number of people who've come before me, who've been doing this work, both in their capacity as organizers and activists, as well as intellectuals and scholars. So I think I'll leave it there, and maybe we can have our conversation, Carl. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that reading from the book and also talking about it. One question that I did want to pose to you to start this off. I mean, there's a lot of research that went into this book. This wasn't, you sat down and wrote some things off the top of your head. You had to look into this because, like I said, I knew some things about police, including I knew about relations between policing in this country and around the world. I had no idea how far back it went and the ways in which it actually was playing a role in things that I thought I knew about, but didn't know there was any role for domestic policing in. And I think I'll ask you about that later. But what I want to start off with is, what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah, I was interested in U.S. foreign policy in the 1960s, and I had a sense that there was some influence of that foreign policy on domestic policy. Certainly, at the time, many people would have made arguments that the war effort in Vietnam came to be so resource intensive that it negatively affected the ability of the Johnson administration to fight poverty at home. So some people, of course, going back to that, were looking into and thinking about these connections. And I was interested in policing, of course, for reasons that you already suggested. That living in New York City, certainly, grew up during Giuliani time, which became Bloomberg time, and it was just impossible to think about any type of social justice activism in New York City without thinking about the kind of outsized role of the NYPD. So that kind of put the idea in my head. So I had these kind of two ideas of the connections perhaps between the war in Vietnam and domestic social policy, and then also policing. And so I kind of put those together in my research. And in doing the research, there's no place to go where one can find an easy explanation to figure out what's the connection between foreign and domestic policy, what's the connection between the military and civilian parts of the state apparatus. When you go to the National Archives, you literally go to two different parts of the room, depending on whether you're looking at civilian records or military records. So I had to kind of navigate some of those challenges of figuring out, well, what are the connections? Because there's no obvious place to look for them that's kind of pre-designated as the place where the connections lie. But over time, I mean, the research process, led me down a lot of dead ends. But ultimately, one of the things that happened in the course of my research was that some certain names, names of people who I talk about in the book at some length, some of these names would appear in places that seemed kind of out of place, basically. They would appear in documents that purported to be about foreign policy, but they were, what I would consider domestic policy figures, or vice versa. They were foreign policy figures, and they would appear in these kind of domestic policy documents. So I just kind of tried to pull on those threads and had to put it all together. Put the archives that were disparate and put them together by finding the connecting factors, and oftentimes it was biographical, and then it became kind of institutional once I built on those biographies.
Okay, so in other words, you saw a need and
That's right.
set out to fill that need. Okay, and I think this book does fill an important need. I mentioned that there were things that I thought I knew about, but I didn't understand this relationship between policing in this country and international policing in relation to them. And I want to ask you about one of those, because when I refused to go to Vietnam, it wasn't because I was coming from an activist background, you know, active against the war in Vietnam, got drafted, and then it was more like I'm a kid who got drafted into the Army.
Mm-hmm.
I got sent to Germany for a while, but then I found, and to my great relief, because I did not want to go to Vietnam because too many people from my neighborhood, too many young men from my neighborhood were coming back maimed, either physically or mentally, or not coming back. So I didn't want that to happen to me. But then I get my orders to go there, and I have to decide, am I going to follow this? And I looked into a lot of things about Vietnam in terms of, is this a war that I should and could be a part of? And one of the things that helped me to decide, no, I cannot be a part of this, was finding out about the Phoenix program.
Mm.
And the way in which, and at the time I would have told you, the US military carried out this program with the Phoenix program and Strategic Hamlets, I think it was. But the Phoenix program was this program where, and I would have said the US military carried out a thing of targeting people who they thought or suspected to be Vietnamese who were against the US domination of their country. They would target them, they would kidnap them, torture them, try to find out more about the broader networks that they were a part of, and assassinate them. And I viewed that as a purely military thing. But, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but in reading the book, you bring out the relationship between some police figures in the US who were advising in Vietnam, and not advising military operations, but actually advising, and in some cases maybe helping to carry out policing operations. And you talked about that in relation to what you said was the destructive, constructive
Mm-hmm.
role of policing. And I guess I'd like you to talk about that some, specifically in relation to the Phoenix program.
Absolutely.
And if I didn't do enough to bring people up to speed on what it is, maybe you can fill that in some.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, you know, in 1954, the French were defeated in Vietnam, and the country became independent, and it was split into two, with the, you know, and of course is a complicated history that I'm going to just give a very brief thumbnail sketch of. And the southern part of the country became the Republic of Vietnam, and the United States immediately started to provide aid and assistance to the government. One of the first aid advisory missions that was created was to police in that country. Really, you know, the ink was barely dry on the peace agreement before the first police experts from the United States landed in South Vietnam to assess capabilities of policing. Now, of course, the country had been under colonial rule for quite some time, So the police force was deeply wrapped up in that colonial history. So it did not maintain a lot of legitimacy among the populace. Over the next decade or so, with great help and resources from the CIA, the civilian police force in South Vietnam was built up. And it became the, pretty much directly repressive instrument of the president, who was Diem. He was a basically hand-picked leader. Again, some experts will perhaps want to debate me on some of the details, but he was enabled to suppress a number of political challenges, not only from the communist left, but other types of challenges among religious minorities and others. He was able to suppress them through the police assistance that the United States provided. And the repression became so intense that many people would argue it stoked the insurgency that ultimately became the force that the United States was so worried about, the National Liberation Front, that the United States felt it had to intervene even more deeply. So from the get-go, police repression sparked political resistance. So Diem is ultimately assassinated in the beginning of November of 1963, just a few weeks before President Kennedy was assassinated. And the police assistance program at that moment was a little bit on the rocks, but ultimately was reconfigured after Diem was out of the picture, and the United States military started to get more deeply involved in the war effort. Over the course of the next decade, when the war was happening, the police forces of South Vietnam grew basically exponentially. Thousands, it went from a force of around, say 10,000 to over 100,000, all with US help. And these forces were, they also grew new types of forces, and they gained new responsibilities. And some of those responsibilities had to do with gathering intelligence, which was, of course, crucial from the United States perspective, crucial to the war effort. Some of it had to do with very mundane types of activities in the cities of Vietnam, because, of course, the war effort mainly took place in rural areas, but with rural areas under aerial bombardment, defoliation, and all types of other, artillery fire, just massive amounts of violence, the urban areas became swollen with refugees, and police oftentimes had responsibilities for these. So, as you mentioned, the Phoenix program was a program operating under the auspices of the South Vietnamese government, but basically at the behest of the CIA. And it was, of course, the military was involved. I mean, everything in Vietnam, the military, US military was deeply involved with. Resources were largely coming from the Department of Defense, but also civilian aid agencies under the Agency for International Development also expended a lot of resources there. And so Phoenix was, as you mentioned, was designed to neutralize, in the term that the CIA used, the infrastructure of the National Liberation Front, the political infrastructure. And what that meant, political infrastructure, what it meant was the revolutionary cadres of the National Liberation Front. Now, of course, there was a huge challenge throughout the war effort, which was, how do we find the suspects who we think, we being the US intelligence and war apparatus, how do we find the right targets? So there were a lot of resources put into the effort to find the right targets, intelligence resources. There were efforts to get people to denounce their neighbors. And of course, as soon as you start asking people to denounce their neighbors, squabbles and vendettas end up feeding into that. And people who might not have anything to do with the revolution end up becoming denounced. But of course, the other factor is that the people who are involved in the revolution themselves, were trying to get the U.S. presence out of Vietnam, and so merely wanting the U.S. to leave, made you potentially a suspect. So the Office of Public Safety, which I focus on in the book, delegates a number of advisors to Phoenix. And some of these advisors are, basically working on behalf of the CIA. They're embedded with South Vietnamese authorities and agencies, including the prison system. But these, like I said, these advisors, they're guys from the U.S. who have deep experience in policing, deep experience in guarding prisons. And they transferred directly over to South Vietnam, and the Phoenix program, of course, it did end up, the neutralization didn't only mean killing; it ended up killing more than 20,000 people that we know of, but it also arrested more and incarcerated people, and some people would also be allowed to defect. Basically, they could be arrested, and then if they were willing to give over intelligence or change their loyalty, they were allowed to defect. So ultimately, neutralization had a pretty wide scope, and it just kind of indicates how broad the political program was. And again, just to kind of emphasize that, policing was central to it. The raids that went into arresting people or potentially killing them, that occurred through the collation of intelligence by and through Phoenix. These raids were basically police raids, and we can see in many ways a long tradition of this type of activity, of police raids on suspects based on their political beliefs, of course, in the United States, all the way through to the present, as well as in any number of foreign interventions that the United States has engaged in subsequent to this. And I think that Phoenix was a program that gained a lot of notoriety. The peace movement, the anti-imperialist movements of that moment they put a spotlight on Phoenix because it seemed so outrageous that so many people were just getting killed for their political beliefs, or even just for being, maybe in the wrong place at the wrong time, even separately from the, of course, outrageous violence of the war effort, from airplanes and tanks and so forth. So people know about Phoenix, but then subsequent to the end of the war effort in Vietnam, there's a seeming eternal return of Phoenix. Critics on the left oftentimes wonder, say in Iraq, was there a new Phoenix program? Whereas some of the strategists or tacticians of the military or intelligence agencies will look to Phoenix and say, that was one thing we did right in Vietnam, and let's bring it back. And so in some ways, both sides are looking to this history that I think is, aspects of it are known now, but how central the U.S. law enforcement expertise was I think is not as well known as it perhaps should be.
Okay, and in going through this, you mentioned the Office of Public Safety, which is probably something not very many people, including people who are listening right now or watching right now, know about, because like I said, I knew something about Phoenix. I first discovered the Office of Public Safety in your book. I don't want to try to say what I think it is, or I could say what I think it is, but you'd have to supplement it, because I discovered that here were these guys who were police figures here in this country who get brought together on a national level here, and especially in the wake of World War II, were put together in order to take their experience as police officers around the world, beginning with, the defeated foes, the Axis powers, Japan, Germany, whatever, and they go there and they supervise and advise on the rebuilding of police structures in those countries. And then following that, they go to various parts of the world where challenges to the new kind of domination that the US is putting together in Vietnam, but also in places like Guatemala, Venezuela, almost you name it.
Right.
They were there. And that's what this Office of Public Security is. And you not only name the figures and gave their backgrounds and traced them back, but you show the coming together of this grouping. And then when you look at the places they went and what they were involved in, you see a long and sordid history. You could go to the 1954 coup in Guatemala against the elected government that did not meet US standards. And then you find some of these guys involved. You go to other places in South America, Vietnam, there was quite a bit. And I think you're right. This is something that people need to know more about in order to understand how we got where we are. But that's my take on it. Is there more that needs to be said about the Office of Public Security so that people... I'm leaving it to you. That I was trying to
sure,
what I got from the book.
Yeah. So, like I said, the Office of Public Safety was created in 1962, and it shut down in 1974 by act of Congress, and the International Police Academy that it operated eventually shut down in 1975. The Office of Public Safety was created by the Kennedy administration, and the Kennedy administration came into office with a sort of foreign policy mandate to turn, in some ways, toward the so-called third world, to meet the challenge that it believed was posed by both the Soviet Union and China, and then and of course Cuba, because the Cuban Revolution had just happened. Meet the challenge, which in its mind, in the mind of the Kennedy administration officials, these countries were trying to gain influence in other countries. They were trying to turn other countries socialist or communist. And so the United States had to answer that challenge. And now, of course, I think many people would argue that the United States was actually more aggressive about pushing its own influence than some of the other countries I mentioned were. And in many ways, their effort to help liberation movements was, of course, a direct response to what was happening on the ground, where the United States was, for example, as you mentioned, say, helping stage a coup in Guatemala. So the Office of Public Safety gains a centralized authority in Washington, D.C. under President Kennedy, and immediately, according to intelligence analysis of the global picture, immediately starts detailing its police advisors to countries where there is a fear that a revolution may soon occur, that subversion is happening. And subversion, of course, was defined in very broad strokes. So what we would consider basic tenets of political organizing, like holding meetings, passing out literature, giving speeches, and then of course holding rallies and demonstrations and labor strikes. All of these types of activities were oftentimes considered first, second, third steps on the road toward revolution, and potentially on the road toward guerrilla warfare or guerrilla insurgency. And so the Office of Public Safety was designed to prevent revolution from breaking out, prevent guerrilla warfare from breaking out. But as I already suggested, in the case of Vietnam, and this was of course true in other places, in many cases, the police repression that ensued, because of course what the Office of Public Safety did was make police better at repression. So once that repression became intense, political movements would themselves intensify their activities. And sometimes if they were operating openly and all of their members were getting arrested, or even worse, in some places, not just getting arrested, but getting killed, disappeared, tortured, these movements would go underground and they would engage in clandestine activities, ranging from, bank robberies to, kidnappings or assassinations. And, in many cases, it's quite clear in retrospect that the more intense radical activities of movements in these third world countries occurred after the implementation of the police assistance program, which oftentimes created types of social control and repression that were just inherently, anti-democratic and placed really strong constraints on what the left could do and how it could operate. And, officials from the United States, liberals in the State Department, they weren't necessarily in favor of massacres or, forced disappearance, but they were afraid of communism. They were deeply committed to the American project of bringing capitalism to the globe, and making sure the United States had access to consumer markets and resources and so forth. And so the argument would be that we need to use the Office of Public Safety to increase the policing capabilities of these countries, because of course we can't gain access to resources or markets if there's criminal activity happening, there's political subversion happening. The police are the first line of defense. That was the term they used frequently, the first line of defense. And they will assure an environment of political stability and security so that economic development, by which they basically meant, the implementation of capitalist social, economic and production relations would be implemented. So, sometimes there, in my research, I would find these State Department, diplomats who would watch with horror as, on the one hand, they believed that the threat of communism was real, but then they also recognized that the resources that they had put into the hands of police, paramilitaries, and then, of course, the military in many countries is another component. They would watch as these were used to create massive amounts of violence, and they would kind of say, well, what have I done? But of course, it was clear all along what they were doing if they had just been willing to look back home at what police did in the United States. Of course, this was during the 1960s. The police in the United States were brutal, they were racist, and they were, quite violent towards the civil rights movement, and not to mention the New Left. So, I think I want to point out that we know about the horrors that occurred, and we know that the U.S. was aware of many of these horrors that occurred, But we should not ourselves be as shocked as some of these officials were at the time, because we know how policing in the United States operates, and we shouldn't be terribly surprised at what the Office of Public Safety ultimately ended up doing. Now, the Office of Public Safety would say, we don't want police in other countries to use the third degree, by which they meant torture and interrogations. We don't want police to shoot protesters down in the street. But then they would, teach, interrogation methods that were not supposed to involve torture, but were still coercive, perhaps. They would teach crowd control methods that involved tear gas, which was meant to alleviate the possibility of shooting people down in the street. But of course, tear gas was still, highly coercive and violent, and suppressed the possibility of peaceful demonstrations, as we're seeing today. So the Office of Public Safety was central in this history of U.S. Activity around the globe. And the last thing I'll just say is, by using these police advisors, the United States hoped to prevent itself from getting drawn in a more active and resource-intensive way. So the war in Vietnam, which was the most resource-intensive and violent activity of the Department of Defense in the 1960s, of course, that was a failure on the part of the Office of Public Safety. The Office of Public Safety did not prevent the revolutionary movement from gaining steam. If anything, as I said, it stoked and encouraged the insurgency. And this was true in a number of other places where the revolutionary movements were more powerful and larger than when, at the end of the period of the police advisory program, than when it was installed. And so I think that tells us a certain lesson about the U.S. limited ability of the United States to achieve its geopolitical goals, in part because it was relying on a flawed institution from the domestic scene, the police of the United States.
Okay, I guess I want to move shortly to the questions from the audience. I guess one more thing that I do want to pose: in my work around building resistance to police terror, exposing the horrors that are brought down, and bringing out to people how this is built into the fabric of this capitalist imperialist system, there's a quote from Bob Avakian that guides me in terms of doing that. And actually, as a revolutionary communist, I'm a follower of Bob Avakian overall. It's a quote from his book, Basics. And chapter 1, quote number 24, he says, "The role of the police is not to serve and protect the people. It is to serve and protect the system that rules over the people, to enforce the relations of exploitation and oppression, the conditions of poverty, misery, and degradation into which the system has cast people and is determined to keep people in. The law and order the police are about, with all their brutality and murder, is the law and order that enforces all this oppression and madness." And a couple of things hit me in relation to this off of reading your book. One is, I'm looking at that in the US context. Reading your book, I realized, oh, there's a global context for this, because there are relations around the world that the US as an imperialist country is working to keep people in, and their approach to policing around the world is the same as their approach here, that police are the front line of defense or frontline enforcers for the relations of oppression and exploitation that they want to keep people in. And I found that to be something that I got a broader understanding of in your book. I wanted to bring that up. I also wanted to maybe ask you to talk about the 1960s, particularly things like the response of the police to the explosion of Black resistance, often sparked off by police brutality, but having behind it more than that, and also how that both drew from global experience and fed into global experience on the front of policing. And maybe tear gas fits in there. Maybe you decide.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I agree with what you said and what you read. And I would say, when we think about the 1960s, it's important to keep in mind, as I think people are doing quite a good job of keeping in mind at this moment, how central police violence was to the experience of the movements, including the civil rights movement, which used nonviolent resistance tactics, which themselves were premised on the notion that the police are going to be brutal, exceedingly violent, and this will lead to outrage. But of course, it took great courage for people to put themselves on the line, knowing that they were going to be brutalized in the process. It's true that in the 1960s, the uprisings that occurred beginning in the North, beginning in 1964 in Harlem, these were almost without exception sparked by an incident of police violence or the rumor of an incident of police violence. Sometimes it was an arrest that looked brutal, which was the case in Los Angeles in 1965 with Watts. It was rumors went around about worse violence than actually had occurred. But of course, it was totally plausible for rumors to spread around that police had killed somebody in the process of an arrest, because it happened all the time, right? So the police experts that I look at in my book, the people who have this kind of global span of vision and who are the kind of leaders of the law enforcement profession in this time, on the one hand, they do recognize that these incidents of racist brutality are harming the public image of the police. On the other hand, they're not willing to concede an inch to the civil rights movement or to more radical left-wing currents that have been denouncing police violence. They would say that any claims of brutality are largely false, even as they know that there are images of brutality that are spreading, that are that people are perceiving with their own eyes if they're not experiencing them themselves. So they're kind of trapped in this way. So they do propose a wide range of reforms, and some of these reforms are meant to improve the police public image. They're kind of public relations types of efforts that will make police seem less brutal. But then they also enact certain types of technical reforms that are trying to, in some ways, mitigate some of this violence. So when these incidents of brutality spawn protests that then are met with further police brutality, which then turns them into uprisings, experts look at this and they say, okay, look, these police are making the situation worse. They're intensifying the unrest. They're intensifying the property destruction and lengthening the uprising. So we need to find an answer to this. Police cannot, as they did in Harlem in 1964, as well as in numerous other places in the 60s, police cannot answer protests and demonstrations and even quote unquote riots with gunfire. They can't shoot into crowds. They can't fire their guns at buildings because this only makes everything worse, right? That's what the experts I look at say. And they say, we know this because we've been telling this to our police advisees in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Indonesia. You know, you kind of name the place around the globe where they're saying to the police in those places, hey, look, if you don't want to have a communist insurgency breakout, stop shooting people dead in the street every time that they engage in protest. Now, they're not saying, you know, let them protest. Instead, they say, use new technologies, obviously gather intelligence and engage in a number of types of activities to prevent protests from even happening in the first place, maybe arrest the organizer on the day before the protest. But then if a protest breaks out, don't fire your guns at the crowd, fire tear gas at the crowd. And the crowd will be forced to disperse, and the feared, you know, protest rally will not occur, while nobody will really, you know, people will suffer. Breathing in tear gas will cause them to feel, you know, acute pain, but it won't leave a mark. It probably won't kill them. They'll go back home, and we'll kind of quell the situation. Now, that was at least the argument they made. In 1968, so the uprising in Newark and Detroit, those were the big uprisings of 1967. There were dozens of others in that year. After that, the Kerner Commission was appointed by the Johnson administration to investigate the causes of that unrest and propose solutions. And of course, the Kerner Commission famously denounced material inequality in the United States, saying, you know, it famously talks about two nations, one black, one white, which, you know, I think there are some ways that we could criticize those findings, but nonetheless, certainly it's true what they said, which is that people in the United States in black neighborhoods are experiencing poor access to healthcare, poor access to food, nutritious food, inadequate housing, police brutality, and so on and so forth. Many of the things that, of course, we would also say are still true in 2020. Now, the Kerner Commission proposes a whole range of reforms that would lessen unemployment, improve education, and so forth. The Johnson administration, Lyndon Johnson himself, basically spurns those out of hand, says no way, because it's going to cost a huge amount of money, billions and billions of dollars. But the Kerner Commission also has an appendix to its report that few people look at nowadays. But the appendix to the report says, these are all the ways that police should engage in protest control or riot control. Among them, use tear gas, gather intelligence, don't fire guns into crowds, so on and so forth. And these recommendations issue directly from the experts who I'm talking about, who are already operating overseas. There's a direct conversation among them. The chief investigator at the Kerner Commission on police, he calls his little office within the Kerner Commission's operations the Office of Public Safety, as a nod to the actual Office of Public Safety, which is operating in dozens of countries around the globe. In the beginning of 1968, the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and a number of other agencies get together, and they propose new riot control guidelines that will be nationally, in operation nationally, and they will also recommend that police start adopting a new type of tear gas that has become available called CS. And now this is the standard tear gas that is used in the United States. At the time, it was not yet standard. And so I explained that adoption process, which has a lot to do with the war in Vietnam. I explained that in the book. But so in April of 1968, King is assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. And immediately there's an outbreak of unrest in many cities across the United States. And some would argue that that was the greatest simultaneous outbreak of unrest in the United States until the past 2 months. So what happened in this outbreak of unrest? National Guard, police, they use tear gas in huge quantities, and they actually don't kill very many protesters. But if you compare to New York and Detroit in 1967, not even a year earlier, police and National Guard killed a great number of protesters and bystanders by gunshot. They used basically no tear gas. So those transformations that I chart in the book, it's the people I look at are integral to these transformations, and they occur quite quickly. And many of the changes that occurred in that moment are with us to this day. And if we had talked, maybe 6 months ago, I would say, well, it perhaps will be the case that the next time there is, an uprising in the United States, police across the country will use CS to put it down. But now we're talking in summer of 2020, and more than 100 cities across the United States, some really, not even cities, small towns, have been using CS on a nightly basis. And so we can draw, I think, a relatively direct line from the period that I study in the book to the present in that way. And the aggressiveness, this is the last thing I'll say, the aggressiveness of the police in using these types of chemical weapons on protesters is also something that I think we can trace directly back to the 1960s. The aggressiveness back then was oftentimes came in the form of gunshots, as well as batons and various other implements of violence. But once we know that CS was used widely in the war effort in Vietnam, as I explained in the book, it becomes quite clear that it's a martial type of weapon. And when it's used by police in this way, it's also being used in an aggressive or offensive or martial fashion. We should see it as being used to attack protesters, not simply to restore order.
Okay, and I got to taste some tear gas a couple months ago up in Minneapolis when I was up there protesting. So and it reminded me of all my experience with tear gas going back to training in the US military, because that's one of the things they do. They have you run into the tear gas, take off your mask, and recite some things. And if you get them wrong, you have to stay there and recite them again. So I remember that tear gas thing. But right now, what I want to do is I want to move us along. We're going to go to the audience participation part. But actually, why don't we do this? Why don't I bring in Raymond Latta, who's going to speak briefly or speak about Revolution Books, the host of tonight's event. Raymond is a spokesperson for Revolution Books, and he's a writer for revcom.us, the website revcom.us. So Raymond?
All right. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Stuart for writing that book and giving that wonderful presentation, and I look forward to the rest of the program. I want to say a few more words about Revolution Books and why your support, those people in the audience and your friends that you've told about this event tonight, and others who will be watching it online afterward, why it's so important to be supporting this bookstore. Well, here we are. We have a demented fascist bully with his hands on the reins of power. And this is a regime that has no regard for human life, while COVID-19 is ravaging the lives of tens and hundreds of thousands. It's a regime that's kidnapping children on the border. It's a regime that is literally pouring fuel on the fire that's burning this planet. Here we are. After the murder, the brutal murder of George Floyd, we saw this beautiful uprising that's transformed the political landscape in this country. And here we are with Revolution Books. And Revolution Books is in New York. Revolution Books is in Berkeley. Hey, welcome. Let's call in the house from Berkeley. Berkeley is here. Revolution Books in Harlem, and we are operating online. We have brick and mortar operations in Berkeley. We're beginning to open in a limited way with curbside sales here in New York. And Revolution Books is this unique resource in these exceptional times, in these extraordinary and unprecedented times of danger in terms of what we are facing. This demented fascist bully has his fingers on nuclear weapons. And if you are asking what it's going to take to end racism, what it's going to take to end the dehumanization and degradation of women, how we can protect this planet, then Revolution Books is for you. If you see your hopes for a better world in the tremendous outpouring, the righteous outpouring, and the conviction of so many people to put an end to white supremacy in these uprisings, in this beautiful uprising, then Revolution Books is for you. And you see, Revolution Books is about a whole different ethos and culture. It's where the whole world comes first. It's about not just putting an end to one form of oppression, but to breaking and shattering and eradicating all the chains of oppression. Revolution Books is about history books that tell the truth, about programs that dig into the real history of this country and the world. Revolution Books is about literature that brings people the stories of the lives of people across this planet. It's about literature that reimagines the past and re-envisions the future. You see, Revolution Books is alive with the scientific understanding that a radically different and far better world is possible. And the beating heart of this bookstore, and Carl referenced Basics by Bob Avakian and talked about himself as a follower of the work and leadership of Bob Avakian. And I'm a follower of Bob Avakian and applying his scientific method and approach to issues of political economy and what we do at this bookstore. But the beating heart of this bookstore is the work and the leadership of Bob Avakian, who has developed the scientific method and approach to make a revolution, to put an end to all these horrors, to emancipate all of humanity. And Avakian has developed a strategy to make this revolution, to free all of humanity, and develop the vision and the blueprint for a society in which all human beings can flourish and we can protect the planet. And this is what animates everything in the bookstore. The search for the truth that goes on here, the kind of dialogues that are taking place right now before you, and others will be involved from the audience. It's what animates the whole process, the joy of knowing and changing the world. And you know, it also is what makes it possible for us to open up the debate about why you can't reform this system in the interests of humanity. And you know, Avakian wrote an article. It's entitled Revolution and Roger Federer's Tennis. What do they have to do with each other? And his answer is actually a lot. And that mind-expanding spirit pulses through Revolution Books. And I want to invite everyone to learn more about and to get involved in Revolution Books. But here's the rub. There's no, and it's not just the rub, it's actually the invitation. And that is, there's no Revolution Books without you in the audience, without your involvement, without your ideas and your creativity and your financial support. And that is so crucial right now, because as I said, we're facing these unprecedentedly dangerous times, and there's possibility, you know, for a new world within these times. And that's what Revolution Books embodies. But we cannot function without your financial support. It is a fight, I have to be perfectly honest, to keep this bookstore open. We are nonprofit, all volunteer, and we can't lose it here in New York, here in Berkeley. We can't lose it for the people of these cities. We can't lose it for the people of the world. And there is no other bookstore like it. And I want to call on each and every one of you to make a donation. And you can do it in two ways. You could become a monthly sustainer. We have a sustainer program, and you can also make a one-time donation. And Katie is going to put up on the screen, if we're prepared, how you can actually donate. You can do it by getting in touch with revolutionbooksnyc.org. You can do it at Venmo at RevBooksNYC. You can do it at the Cash App, $RevBooksNYC. So again, I want to call on everyone to donate to this bookstore, which is a crucial lifeline for people who hunger for radical fundamental change and who aspire to a world without all oppression and exploitation. And this is where you discover the most important political thinker and leader in the world today, Bob Avakian. And we're going to work, not just to save this bookstore, but to make it even more impactful. And we need your ideas, we need your funds, we need your creativity. And we have some very, very exciting programming that will be developing very soon. Bob Avakian has written this very momentous statement on the immediate critical situation, the urgent need to drive out the fascist Trump-Pence regime, voting in this election, and the fundamental need for revolution. We're going to be doing special programming in connection with this statement, forums, author talks, cultural events, and this is all in the lead up to the election. We'll be announcing more about that, and we want your ideas, and we'll be calling upon you and counting on you, to be bringing forward, ways in which we can really impact, society and the world in these critical times. So make this one-time donation or become a sustainer, and we're all in this together to know and change the world and to bring a far better and radically different world into being. This is Revolution Books. This is for you. And I'm now going to hand the program back over to Carl and Stuart. And you see the donation opportunities here on the screen. And let's go forward and have more programs like this and spread the word.
Carl, if you're...
There I am.
There you are.
I'm unmuted now.
Thank you.
Katie's our conduit to what's been coming forward from the audience. I just want to reiterate that Stuart's book is available for purchase at the online book site of Revolution Books. It's revolutionbooksnyc.org for a special discount price tonight, $29.71, I believe, $29.71. Take advantage of that special offer, and we'll get some questions, comments from Katie, and we'll talk about them.
Yes, thank you for that. We do have, I have some questions myself, but we do have a question from the audience here. It looks like a couple of questions and a comment from Kevin in New York City, I believe. He says, in Elizabeth Hinton's book, From War on Poverty to War on Crime, she discusses in great detail the conscious evolution of mass incarceration society we live in now. Alongside of this has been the hyper-extension of US power globally at the same time as growth of economic globalization. You've documented links and connection between these domestic police practices and to policing around the world, going back decades. How much of these two things, a conscious global approach to maintaining US empire? This kind of goes back to the point you made earlier, where Huey Newton talks about internal colonialism. Could you comment on this in light of the fact that fascists are in power in many key parts of the world, including right here in the US?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. Absolutely, my book builds on the work of scholars like Elizabeth Hinton, who've really done incredible job of laying out how the road to mass incarceration was built by liberal policymakers of the going back all the way back to the Kennedy administration, if not earlier. And what I show in the book is that these policymakers, in many ways, thought about foreign policy in very similar ways as they thought about domestic policy. The problems that they believed led to criminal activity in the American cities, in what they would have called the ghettos of American cities. They believed that poverty was at root, that social alienation was a cause. Now, what the Johnson administration did was, of course, inaugurate the so-called Great Society, the war on poverty. And this did not mean, just giving money to poor people, even if that might have been a good idea. It meant instead various forms of, say, job training, various forms of assistance that would allow poor people, economically marginalized and socially and politically marginalized people to, help themselves. The idea was to allow people on the margins to feel like they were gaining membership in American society, which of course had a very paternalistic tone to it. But the notion was that they could participate. The War on Poverty famously had a language built into it about maximum feasible participation. But in order for people to participate to the maximum in, kind of crafting the designs of what a better society might look like, working toward that better society and kind of reaping the rewards of that better society, none of which actually happened. And I think, anybody who's tuned in here would, of course, understand that within the confines of capitalism as it existed at that point, it was impossible to eradicate some of the economic exploitation and degradation that was at the cause of social alienation. But nonetheless, in order for people to participate, they had to be assured that there was a kind of fundamental foundational level of what they would have called law and order or security. And I argue that this was true abroad as well. Overseas, the United States even used language about participation, very similar to the language of, in foreign aid, very similar to the language of the war on poverty. And there was also a sense that in order for economic development to occur, which again meant basically the implementation of American-style capitalism, there needed to be an environment of security, an environment of law and order. And so for that reason, police would be used domestically and police would be used overseas to kind of create this foundation of security. But I think that it's important for us to recognize that security as a kind of imperative is voracious. Any threat to security, any kind of evidence of insecurity has to be stamped out. If there's insecurity, by definition, the efforts to assure security aren't working, so they have to be intensified. And this was true domestically as it was true overseas. And so, as scholars like Hinton show, the war on poverty included within it a number of mechanisms to punish people who did not engage in this type of self-help, who did not, fix their own problems of poverty, which of course, poor people can't solve their own problems of poverty within the context of capitalism. The entire, system needs to be completely transformed. So it's an impossible task that's put on the economically marginalized. And when they mess up, fail, don't evidence the right kind of behaviors, the police are waiting with guns drawn to discipline them. And so the war on crime is kind of built into the essence of the war on poverty, because there's a suspicion that the poor are likely to commit crime, that Black people are likely to commit crime, that Puerto Ricans are likely to commit crime. There's a suspicion kind of built into the whole institution and edifice. And this, of course, as the question suggested, leads toward the building up of the institutional capacity for mass incarceration with time, just as it leads to overseas the building up of the institutional capacity for mass incarceration in other places. South Vietnam had a system of mass incarceration. The rate of incarceration at the height of the US war in South Vietnam was appalling, just as the rate of incarceration in the United States today is appalling. And we shouldn't think of these as coincidences. We should think of them as deeply intertwined, because the same policymakers involved in analogous institutions operating under the same ideological principles, all for the same goal of kind of fostering capitalist economic development, are at root on both sides of the foreign domestic divide. And so that's what my book is really dedicated to analyzing and digging into.
Okay, let me jump in here, particularly on the point that the questioner raised, in light of the fact that fascists are in power in many parts of the world, including here in the US. Because, you're right about the suspicion that they have, particularly of marginalized groups in society. But I would say that over and above the suspicion is a fear of what those sections of people might do in response to the continued subjugation that they face, especially post-1960s, because they remember what Black people did back then. And there have been moves to try to ensure that those don't get repeated. But as things develop, there actually are sharp differences at the top of society over what's the best way to keep things under control. And we're seeing that right now in terms of the fact that, look, there's literally a fascist regime in the White House working to consolidate its hold on power. And I think that's very important to look at. And policing even comes into the picture on this, because, and it's not like the Democrats, who are not the fascists, haven't unleashed the police on Black people, on brown people, and all like that. That's a real thing that they have done, but it is being taken to another level by the Trump-Pence regime. And you can see that in Portland, when you have these federal agents descending on the city, camouflage gear, not identified, and actually accountable to no one but the executive. And they're grabbing protesters, they're firing less lethal stuff at people, tear gas, all of this. And this is just step one, because now they're talking about, we're going to send them into Chicago to deal with the killings there. We've got them in Kansas City, Detroit's on the list, Philadelphia, Oakland, Baltimore, where I was born and grew up. So this is a very important thing to look at, because just on the point of policing, I think you said in your conclusion, police-led counterinsurgency aims to liquidate the social antagonism towards capitalist order. Well, to do that, police can't be a static thing. They have to transform as new challenges are brought up, and they are led to transform by the forces at the top. And in this case, the transformation is to be a part of, or could be a part of, if they're not stopped, carrying out a clamp down on many of the rights that, however inconsistently available, their availability matters. It actually matters that, you know, even during Jim Crow segregation, Black people could take things to court, fight in that arena, and ultimately get it overturned through Brown versus Board of Education. Although I should note that you pointed out in your book that there was a Jim Crow pass given by the 1968 crime bill to police departments in the South that refused to hire Black people. They didn't have to start hiring Black people in order to get the federal money, which is a thing to take note of.
Yeah.
Even as they're saying we're going to end this segregation, it's like, but to keep our police in shape, we might have to let some segregation keep going down.
That's right. Yeah.
But I think that's an important point that the questioner was raising, and I did want to bring that in. And I just want to underscore what Raymond had to say about the statement by Bob Avakian on the immediate critical situation, the urgent need to drive out the fascist Trump-Pence regime, voting in this election, and the fundamental need for revolution. This is a very thorough statement by Bob Avakian. Just came out a couple days ago, and people who are wondering what we need to do in this situation really need to check this statement out. I will just prefigure a little bit in it. He does say we have to act to drive this regime out. It is impermissible to say we're going to wait for the election and vote him out. He also says, though, that voting against Trump is a permissible and acceptable means of nonviolently working to drive the regime out. It's just not the main one and should not be relied on. And people should get into that, because the Revolutionary Communist Party has never been into bourgeois elections. In fact, we called them bourgeois electoral bullshit. So it's significant that this revolutionary leader has made that statement at this point. People should check it out. And we are going to be doing some programming at Revolution Books. Pay attention to it. Word will come out on around that in the next couple of days. I don't know if you want to.
Thanks for that. Yeah, sure. Thanks. You know, to pick up on the on a few of the threads that you mentioned, I do think that the rise of fascism across the globe that we're seeing in recent years, you know, I don't want to place too much emphasis or give too much of a causal role to the history that I look at in my book. But I do think that it's significant to look at a place like the Philippines or a place like Brazil. These were countries that were absolutely integral to U.S. national security strategy during the Cold War, and they received a great deal of police assistance under the auspices of the Office of Public Safety. And in many respects, both Duterte and Bolsonaro, when they, just as Trump himself does, you know, when they hark back to, you know, or try to bring the memory of a period that they want to, you know, they want to evoke, and they want their regime to mark a return to a bygone past. Well, that past is the height of the Cold War, the height of the assistance provided by the United States to dictatorships in those countries. The United States gave police assistance to Brazil both before and after the coup, which deposed a democratically elected leader. And I think it's notable to point that out, because it's the United States in some sense said, you know what, we don't really care, democratically elected or coup by the military, we're fine either way. And of course, the U.S. played a role in the coup itself. But we're going to provide police assistance because we know that the police are going to maintain a focus on social control. They're going to repress the left, no matter what the kind of official formal style of government is. And so I think that is instructive because, as you say, it's absolutely imperative to have the Trump administration out of the White House, but that will not, on the other hand, solve many of the problems of injustice and racism around policing that we're seeing, in the United States. And I think that we do need to, again, as you mentioned, pay close attention to the revolutionary and insurrectionary power of everyday people that we've seen in evidence over the past couple months in the United States. People have risen up against police violence, and just as you said, police have been terrified of this. The ruling powers have been terrified of this because it happened in the 1960s, and now it has happened again. And efforts to derail the push for radical transformation of policing, whether we call it defunding or we call it dismantling, we call it abolition, efforts to derail this are, of course, happening right now before our very eyes, to block it, to prevent it, and so forth. And I think it's just really crucial to, pay attention to the demands that are happening in the street, the sophistication and savvy of protesters and what they've been pushing for, and note that the response of the Trump administration to it has been to intensify repression, as you said, in Portland, and perhaps soon in additional places. That intensified repression is both a response to the political mobilizations, and I think is also continuing to radicalize people. People are really upset about what they're seeing, and to that extent, I'm hopeful because, of course, I don't want to see this brutal violence of police, but I am optimistic about the way that it has galvanized people and pushed people to really pay attention to police power and how central it is to the to what American society looks like. Of course, many people already knew that, but not everybody. And I think now it's a lot harder to deny.
Okay, so Katie?
Yes, so we're still getting, I think people are just kind of listening, but I just want to say out loud for people who aren't noticing the comment section of Facebook, for those who are just tuning in audio, you can add your comments and questions in the comment section of Facebook. If you are not logged into Facebook or don't have an account, I can also receive questions and comments via email. Just send your email to, or send your question or comment to revbooksnyc@yahoo.com. Another note, we double checked the price of Stuart's book, and the discounted price is actually $25.46. So I think that was a little different from what Carl said.
It's a bargain.
Yes, it really is. And that's available on revolutionbooksnyc.org. And also just really quickly to point out the other two books that we have on sale that are kind of related topics at shop.revolutionbooksnyc.org. A book about fascism, how fascism works, the politics of us and them by Jason Stanley, who actually spoke at Revolution Books last year, and Separated, Inside an American Tragedy by Jacob Soboroff. And that's about obviously what's happening at the US-Mexico border. And I just want to say, Stuart, while I was so much of what you were saying, even though, you were talking about the past, I know your book focuses primarily on the 1960s and more generally, basically the entire Cold War era, I guess, like post-World War II through 70s or so.
Yeah.
But so much of what you were saying, I felt like you were talking about what's going on now. And I know we've kind of been talking a little bit about that. especially when you were talking about the civilian police force in Vietnam and how those actions like led people to understand that, the more repressive these police forces get, the more it actually stokes insurgency. That became the very concern that the United States had in the first place. And I feel like that's what we've been seeing all over this country in the past couple months.
Yeah.
3 or I guess, yeah, we're up to like 3 months now, since George Floyd, especially. And then really, especially what we saw in Portland last week or two. And so you've been sort of alluding to it, but I'm just wondering if your research has sort of continued more, if you've been, how much you've been studying what's been going on now with specifically Portland most recently, but also if you've been able to evidence of, more of the, I guess you could say, the more subtle infiltration of maybe like the Black Lives Matter movement or other activist groups that have been out in the street, if you've been able to find any evidence of anything like that. So I guess those are kind of my big questions just about Portland and our, the US now federal civilian troops, whatever they're trying to call it, as well as, more generally infiltration into Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, so I published a short article a couple weeks ago in the New Republic about Portland, where I try to kind of connect what's been happening there to this history from the Cold War. It's comes to a fairly pessimistic conclusion, but so I guess I would encourage folks to look that up if you want to see my thoughts about Portland directly. But I would just say that, I look in the book at the Cold War. The book basically ends in the middle of the 1970s. What's interesting is that activists pushed to get the Office of Public Safety shut down, and they succeeded. In fact, they almost used the language of today's activists and protesters. They basically said, defund, abolish this agency because it's leading to brutal repression around the world. And so they were successful. But where they were unsuccessful in a way, or they maybe didn't exactly anticipate what was going to happen next, is that the program of police assistance officially came to an end and was then reborn in new guises. And those new guises, in part, there was a private sector dimension to it, and in part, there were new missions. So the Drug Enforcement Administration took on some of those missions. Then the Border Patrol took on some of those missions. And you can kind of run a line from the rebirth of police assistance after it was supposed to have officially ended in the mid-70s all the way to the present. Because in Portland, one of the units of federal law enforcement that was operating against protesters was this unit called BORTAC, which is the Border Patrol's, basically SWAT teams. It's their tactical unit. BORTAC, not exclusively, but frequently is operating around the globe, training border police of other countries. It's operating in the Middle East, it's operating in Central America. It's a direct descendant of the operations of the Office of Public Safety that I look at in my book. So I think there are a lot of continuities to look at in that regard. And, I can only say that more research has to be done to unearth all of them, and many people are doing that work right now, and I think we're learning more with each passing day. I don't really know anything in particular about infiltration of movements, although I think that it's certainly something to be wary of and be concerned about. I would also say that the figures that I look at in my research, they were into surveillance, and they would be utterly blown away by the capabilities of surveillance that exist now. Most of us carry a little surveillance device in our pockets that we tend to think of as a phone, but in fact, it's a very useful device that allows all kinds of tracking. And I think that it's crucial to recognize that today protests are being watched in many different ways. Political activity is being watched in many different ways. Not only is there the pocket-held surveillance device that we carry, but there are, of course, networks of surveillance cameras, police cameras oftentimes cover vast stretches of cities. And there's new forms of aerial surveillance as well. And this is in part where the feds come in again. We know that during the protests, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, and various agencies have been engaged in aerial surveillance, in addition to the local police camera surveillance that is operating in many places. And there are also private firms engaged in this as well. So all of that is just to say that, even if there isn't somebody engaging in various forms of provocation or informing, as we know happened to a really deep extent, and I'm sure Carl could speak at length about this in his own life experience. We know that this has occurred throughout the history of radical movements, of course, in the 1960s and 70s, as well as before. But in addition to any of that might be happening, which might be hard to know about right now, I think we can all be certain that various forms of photographic and digital surveillance are constantly happening. And it's a good reason for people to be quite careful and cautious, but it also shouldn't make people afraid to protest. And I think that there's a very fine line to be drawn between being wary of government surveillance and being paralyzed by fears of it. And I think it's important that we not stray too far toward the paralysis.
Thank you for that. We do have an audience question, but just before I forget, what you said about that, and we can go back to my question in a moment, but yeah, just the idea of like the various methods that they have, and perhaps it is heightened now by our increased security, whether they're reading our text messages or they're using more sophisticated, I don't know if it's more sophisticated or the same things they did before, where they would sort of infiltrate a group in a way and try and start trouble from within, rather than just immediately having a group sort of like broken up or arrested. So we can speak to that in a moment if you have anything to say on that, but I do have an audience question. Jackie asked, could you please speak to the role of this reformulated police assistance programs and repressive regimes in the Middle East, Africa, and various fundamentalist groups? Thank you, Jackie.
Yeah, well, I of course, it's a big question, and I'm not sure that I have all the expertise necessary to answer it. I've done a little bit of research. I would just say that the United States to this day is assisting police around the globe. Unlike during the Cold War, during the Cold War, the mission was a fairly singular mission, so to speak. It was about preventing communist revolution. Today, the ideological purposes of it, of course, the United States is still quite interested in preventing communist revolution, but it has a slightly different diagnosis of the risk of that happening. And now a lot of the police assistance that's going on today is oriented toward two kind of primary purposes: counterterrorism, which of course is a very vague term, and counter-narcotics. We know that under the banner of counter-narcotics, all the way going back to the 70s, a lot of political policing activity has occurred. In fact, many people would argue that the kind of counterinsurgency policing that I look at in my book really continues under the guise of controlling narcotics beginning in the 70s. So I think that is all still happening to this day. And the United States is providing, copious resources. Of course, the United States, as we know, sells military-grade weapons to many countries around the globe, which there's a lot of money involved in that, both the weapon sales and the grants of weapons. But so it's still cheaper to train police than to sell, a fighter jet or whatever. So the numbers might ultimately not be as big as we might imagine. So like one jet could cost several million or $100 million or whatever. But for that amount of money, you can train dozens and dozens or hundreds of police. And so the United States does that, continues to do that. And so, it flies under the kind of public radar. I think a lot of people do have some sense that arms sales, especially after, the Ukraine fiasco, a lot of people have a sense that arms sales are a way that U.S. foreign policy operates that we should be critical of or condemn. But then because police assistance is cheaper, and this was true during the Cold War as well, nobody pays that much attention to it. But in fact, I think that police assistance might have a greater actual impact on the everyday lives of people around the globe, because it's unlikely in most situations outside of a real war type conflict that the sale of a missile defense system is going to be felt in people's everyday lives, whereas the training of police and how to affect searches for narcotics, well, guess what, it's quite likely that many people will feel the effects of that in their lives around the globe. So I think it's important, and like I said, I think there's still a lot of research to be done, and it's hard to do research about what's happening right now because documents are not available, various forms of classification exist. It's much easier to do, in some ways, to do historical research because the documents are now available. So it's hard to know exactly the full extent of what's going on, but I think we should be pretty certain that there is quite a lot going on.
Thank you. And just while we're waiting for more questions to come in, this is sort of to that point. We did recently have an author on who spoke about some of the things you were mentioning earlier about border patrols and how we're training border patrols, in all these different ways. And then also, just for our audience, next Tuesday, August 11th, we are having Augustine Sedgwick to talk about his book, Coffeeland, an extraordinary economic, cultural, and social history of the world's most popular drug and global capitalism. So coffee isn't exactly a weapon nor narcotics, but that same idea of global capitalism. And just a quick time check, it is 9 o'clock. So I'm not seeing more comments right now. Carl or Raymond, if you have anything to add, or Stuart, if there's anything else.
Yeah, I think we should go towards the wrap up here.
Okay, perfect.
If there are any closing remarks you want to make, Stuart, now would be the time to do it.
Sure. Thanks very much. I greatly appreciate this opportunity, and I really am grateful to Revolution Books and to you, Carl, and Katie and Raymond for organizing this event. I hope everybody continues to support Revolution Books, and this has been a great conversation. So thank you.